The introduction of Young Griff into the narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire understandably made waves. And given that there are so many characters within the story who aren't actually who they say they are, it should come as no surprise that most readers presume that this young man claiming to be Aegon Targaryen, long-lost son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell, was a fake. Add in the fact that Daenerys has already had premonitions about the common people cheering for cloth dragons, and the hints that Griff may actually be a Blackfyre instead of Targaryen, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that fans believe that Aegon is actually Faegon. However, there's actually an enormous amount of subtextual support behind the idea that young Griff is exactly who he says he is. One of the most obvious indications that Faegon is Aegon is the dynamic between House Targaryen and House Martell. Although House Martell has been sidelined for the majority of A Song of Ice and Fire's narrative, they're one of the great houses of Westeros, and their family history is one of the most interesting in the entire series. House Martell, aka House Nymeros Martell, was founded through the marriage of Mors Martell and Queen Nymeria, a Rhoynish queen who fled Essos when the Valyrian freehold continued its expansion and the threat of their dragons and fire magic became too much for these river worshippers and water witches to handle. After years of wandering and failure, Queen Nymeria and her Rhoynish cohorts finally found a place that they could survive in Dorne. But Mors Martell saw an opportunity to advance his own house through Nymeria, and thus, the modern House Martell and modern Dorne were born. For the most part, the Rhoynar assimilated into Dornish society, with the Rhoynar abandoning important aspects of their own culture like their religion in order to fit in. However, certain elements of their culture, for instance their belief in equal rights for women, stuck around. So, right off the bat, it's incredibly interesting that House Martell's presence in Westeros wasn't just driven by the Valyrians and their dragons, but that the story of their journey to and integration into Westeros is in direct contrast to House Targaryen. The Targaryens were one of the lesser Dragonlord families in the Valyrian freehold, and according to their family lore, one of their family members foresaw the doom of Valyria, so they decided to leave and settle on Dragonstone. The truthfulness of this claim is a little dubious anyway. However, if it's true, then the Targaryens were aware that their country and countrymen were about to be destroyed, but instead of pulling an Nymeria, they left on their own and left the Valyrians to their doom. Once the Valyrian freehold had been destroyed, the Targaryens were the last remaining Dragonlords. And after they came to the realization that they were the only family in the world with that literal firepower, they looked to the west, and Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya chose to conquer the Seven Kingdoms and make them into one country united under Targaryen rule. Fairly quickly, every kingdom outside of Dorne either fell or bent the knee to Targaryen rule, but the Dornish put up a significant fight. For the most part, the strategy that they employed was to simply not be there when the Targaryens came looking for a fight. But their resistance was strong, and they even successfully killed Rhaenys and her dragon. The Dornish never knelt to the Targaryens or the Iron Throne, and the conflict between the Dornish and the Targaryens only truly came to an end nearly 2 centuries after the Targaryens first invaded, when House Martell and House Targaryen were united through marriage, and Meryn Martell ironically married Daenerys I. And House Martell and Targaryen aren't just on opposite sides of a literal conflict. The ideologies of both houses seem to be in direct conflict as well. House Martell, while not perfect, is the most egalitarian house in all of Westeros. And while the Rhoynar were willing to ditch vital aspects of their culture in order to integrate with the Westerosi, many of their moral stances are aspects of their culture that they integrated into Dornish culture as well. Queen Nymeria waged war against the Valyrians at first, but when it became a choice between retaining the lands, power, and magic that belonged to the Rhoynar, she chose to take her people and flee in order to keep them alive. She relocated a race of water worshippers to a literal desert because she, and by extension now House Martell, valued peace and survival over war and power. House Targaryen has always been an elitist and isolationist house. And although they did manage to conquer Westeros, their inability to remain united and their conflicts with one another weakened their house to the point where they unintentionally lost the magic that made them powerful. And even once their dragons were gone, they couldn't pull it together to manage the kingdoms well and maintain the power that they so desperately desired. These core values of each house, House Martell's values of peace, security, safety, and equality, as well as House Targaryen's values of strength, power, personal achievement, isolationism, and elitism, have carried through to the Martells and Targaryens within the present storyline too. Doran Martell has largely stayed out of the conflicts in Greater Westeros, as well as sacrificed many opportunities for revenge, because of his fears of the unintended consequences and real cost of collateral damage. And despite the fact that House Lannister is one of House Martell's greatest enemies, Arianne Martell is devastated when her foolish plans result in Myrcella's maiming, because she still recognizes that Myrcella is innocent and she wouldn't punish one person for another person's crimes. On the other hand, Viserys and Daenerys often fantasize about avenging their family by destroying the usurper's dogs, without understanding any distinction between their supposed enemies or recognizing that entire houses aren't responsible for the actions of a few of their members. And of course, both Viserys and Daenerys are more than aware of the massive human cost of their lofty goals, but they simply see that collateral damage as a necessary price to pay for their own greatness. These two great houses have history that goes back centuries and continents. Their fundamental outlooks on themselves and the world are in direct opposition to one another, and there is really no other family in Westeros that has a more intense and storied history with the Targaryens than the Martells do. But what's even stranger is that this history has been almost entirely irrelevant throughout the story so far, and if Young Griff isn't actually who he says he is, then it will continue to remain irrelevant. But if Faegon is really Aegon, then when he arrives in Westeros, he's going to have to decide what kind of king he wants to be. His claim will rest on the fact that he's a Targaryen, but clearly choosing a more Martell style of ruling would make him a much better ruler. Both the Targaryens and the Martells are families of SOC origins who changed the face of Westeros forever. But the Martells arguably advanced the civilization of Dorne, while the Targaryens arguably made the state of the Seven Kingdoms even worse. But of course, if Aegon is just a Blackfyre, these contrasting ideologies won't really be relevant either. There are many other reasons why Young Griff makes sense as the true Aegon Targaryen as well. Daenerys is quite obsessed with the notion that her family has been usurped from their rightful place on the throne, and she's determined to, at least in her mind, right something that has been done wrong. However, it's easy to forget that Daenerys is herself a usurper. Not only has she consistently conquered lands and peoples that she has no legitimate claim to, but as far as she knew, her brother was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. But she killed him because to her, he wasn't a true Targaryen. Fans have an easy time overlooking this because even if Viserys by some miracle managed to reclaim the throne, then he would have been a terrible king. And it's easy to overlook all of the other usurping Dany has done because she has in large part overthrown rulers who were terrible people. However, if Daenerys has to go through a nearly complete character deconstruction in order to become the ultimate villain of the story, then there's a really beautiful symmetry to the idea that she began her quest for the Iron Throne by usurping the true heir of the Iron Throne, who is also a nightmare, and then will end her quest by usurping the true heir of the Iron Throne who is actually a wonderful king, but who doesn't qualify as a true Targaryen in Dany's mind. Daenerys also assumes that the cloth dragon that she sees is a false dragon, and thus, many readers make the same assumption about Aegon. But even putting aside the fact that most people in the books interpret prophecies and premonitions incorrectly, the concept of a cloth dragon doesn't necessarily represent a fake dragon. It could just as easily represent a harmless dragon. Young Griff's claim to the throne rests on his Targaryen heritage, but he's a man who has spent his life being raised to be the best king he could possibly be. And a good king would never hurt his people. Unfortunately, real dragons are only capable of destruction, and when they're used in conquest, thousands of people suffer and die in the wake of that destruction. Logically, most common people would never cheer for a real dragon, but the harmless image of a dragon poses no threat at all. So, The metaphorical representation of the dragon in Dany's premonition could just as easily represent a true Targaryen, just one without the firepower, as it could represent a fake Targaryen. This also leads into another important aspect of why the assumption that Young Griff is Faegon may be wrong. George R.R. Martin loves using his POV writing style to lead his readers into traps, and this could easily be the best trap in the entire series. Not only do fans assume that Aegon is Faegon because Dany does, but because, well, we already know who is meant to fill the roles that Aegon is meant to fill. The entire story has been building up to the idea of Daenerys raising an army, invading Westeros, and reclaiming the Iron Throne in the name of House Targaryen. And Jon Snow has always been the hidden prince who is the true heir to the Iron Throne, destined to avenge House Stark and become the greatest Targaryen ruler in history. So, if the hidden prince Aegon shows up, reclaims the Iron Throne, and avenges his wronged mother and House Martell, then he's essentially stealing Jon and Dany's thunder. And of course, he can't do that, because Jon and Dany are the most important characters in the series. However, that actually makes Aegon's legitimacy seem even more likely, not less. Ironically, he's the character who's actually meant to fulfill all the fantasies that many fans have had about Jon and Dany for years. And even more ironically, he's meant to dismantle a lot of the idealizations that readers have had about both characters for the entire series. After all, if Jon winds up making a deal with Dany that ends with her usurping his brother, then he's not the flawless epic hero that his archetype suggests. And if Dany murders the true heir to the Iron Throne, then she's not the tough underdog fighting for true justice instead of for her own desires. And in looking at Dany and Jon's character journeys prior to the start of the story, it's even more difficult to believe that Aegon is Faegon. Dany is just the sister of the believed heir to the Iron Throne, and yet she and her brother were spirited away from Dragonstone to Essos and survived for years, despite the fact that Viserys was believed to be the greatest living threat to Robert Baratheon's reign. And on the other side of that coin we have Jon, a boy who no one even knows is a Targaryen, who was rescued and raised by Ned, a barely politically competent man who had almost no help and who managed to keep Jon a secret for his entire life. So contrast that with Aegon, a baby who is due to inherit the Iron Throne, and who has Varys and likely dozens of other people in King's Landing who not only are looking out for the heir to the Iron Throne at any cost, but who were politically savvy enough to understand the immediate threat that Robert's rebellion causes. Why is it believable that Jon and Dany would be rescued and hidden away, while someone as clever and capable as Varys wouldn't be able to save the real Aegon and keep him safe as well? But ultimately, even putting all of the world-building, subtext, and narrative clues aside, the fact is, Young Griff being Aegon is just the more interesting story. Jon and Daenerys having to fight against the true heir to the Iron Throne is a story that actually has stakes and forces them to make hard decisions that have no easy answer. If Young Griff is just a Blackfyre pretender, then there's no real dramatic tension to his story. And the only real question is whether or not Jon or Dany would be in the wrong to get rid of a usurper who happens to be a good leader. The existence of the real Aegon Targaryen seems like exactly the kind of narrative trickery that George R.R. Martin loves to engage in anyway. But if Aegon is just Faegon, then what exactly is the point of introducing him or introducing all of this other buildup in the first place? Obviously, it'll be quite a while before readers get any solid information one way or another. And it's entirely possible that George will leave the truth of Young Griff's parentage as a mystery forever. But honestly, the story is just more interesting if Aegon Targaryen is exactly who he says he is. So, what do you think? Is Young Griff truly Aegon Targaryen, or is he just a long-lost Blackfyre? Or is he no one at all? Leave a comment below with your verdict. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.